Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome another Thursday night. That means it's date night. Tracy, how many weeks have we been doing this now?
Four, maybe 4 or 5.
4 weeks online. We've been doing date nights for as long as we've been married, even before we actually went on dates before we got married, which I think is pretty cool.
Nothing but marital bliss over here.
Now, tonight we're talking about boundaries in marriage, but this is going to be fun because, as we said last week, we were going to try to double date tonight.
Yep.
And we think we figured it out, the technology behind it all. We've invited Zach and Heather Johnson to join us. So Zach, Heather, thank you for figuring out the technology on your end. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the topic?
Yeah, well, my name is Zach, and this is Heather, my wife. We've been married 3 years.
Almost 3 years.
Yeah, it's been 3 years. Yeah, we've been married 3 years now. We
Zach,
have
math is hard. We recognize Zach, math is hard.
I got you.
I stopped doing math when work stops in the evenings, but
true.
we've been married almost 3 years now. We have a 16-year-old daughter who was 13 when we got married, and Heather is actually pregnant with our second, and she is 7 months pregnant. So with a little boy.
Excited about that.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I was there at your wedding. We both were actually. You were gracious to invite Tracy as well, and it's been awesome to watch you guys and your family grow. We're so excited for your new one on the way. So tonight's topic, Tracy, is going to be good because Zach and Heather can kind of represent this topic of setting boundaries in parenting from the vantage point of having a little one on the way. So we can talk about young boundaries.
Yeah.
Having a teenager, we of course have a teenager still at home, but they can also represent some of the blended family stuff.
Right.
So before we get into some of the topics and questions, and again, couples at home watching this, remember, use those questions down below and talk about this on your own. Maybe not right now during the live stream, but as soon as this is over, the whole point here is we're sparking a conversation and helping you grow your marriage. So Tracy, before we get into any of that stuff, what are we talking about when we're talking about boundaries in parenting? Is this like a social distancing thing? Or?
No. We're going to talk about the importance of boundaries as that internal mechanism that as we're training our kids, as we're using discipline and structure, that we're teaching them the safety lines they should have around their life, their boundaries, to know who they are, to know who other people are, to know how they should act, how they should allow other people to treat them, issues of respect and safety and all of that. So boundaries in parenting is about parents teaching their kids these boundaries, teaching them those internal mechanisms so that eventually, and we're getting close with a couple of them, they can launch from our home and be independent, healthy adults.
So let's start with this question. And since we're on a double date, and we've done this with Zach and Heather over dinner back in the day when we could actually go to restaurants. And
I know.
dinner.
What was that like?
I know. But so this is good. This feels like we're sitting here sharing a meal together, guys. Which one of you is better at setting boundaries? Not even in parenting, but just in general, which one of you is better at setting boundaries?
Definitely Zach. Definitely Zach. Would you agree?
Yeah, I feel like I have a better ability to set boundaries. I think maybe that's the way that I was raised, and in the way that I was raised to be independent. But yeah, we definitely set boundaries in a different way as parents, for sure.
Now, Tracy, if we were to ask that of ourselves, what would you say? I think I know the answer to this. It's pretty obvious.
I would be interested to hear your answer.
She is definitely better at setting boundaries. So an example of me not setting boundaries is I'm the guy that would be like, a buddy's stopping through, town, and I'm like, hey, yeah, come on over, and I'll forget to tell her, or I'll say, yeah, you can stay with us, and I'll forget to tell her, things like that. So those are examples in everyday life of like not really good. I was never, man, this is good for you to be aware of. Like I wasn't always really sure where I stopped and where someone else began, or where someone else stopped and where I began. And the reason this is so important, obviously, is if moms and dads, if you don't understand what a boundary is and how to set a healthy boundary for yourself, then there's no way you're going to set a healthy boundary for your kids. And then I think that's where sometimes really bad things can happen, right? When you don't know how to set good
Oh
boundaries.
yeah, that's when you get in unhealthy relationships. But I would say on that point too, that there are times that I am a little bit too permissive. Like I'll have set a boundary with my kids or like a rule, and then I'll want to give in that. Whereas I feel like sometimes you'll step in and be like, well, wait a second, there's a bigger lesson here. If we let them get away with that, then we're not teaching them the principle we're trying to teach them. So I'm not always good at boundaries, I wouldn't say.
Okay, so let's talk about teenage kids for a second. Zach and Heather, share about Heather. This might be more for you. Have you had to set some boundaries with your daughter for, let's start with friendships?
Absolutely. And quite honestly, prior to getting married, that's why I said that Zach is a lot better at setting boundaries. Being a single mom for 13 years, Madison would call me a helicopter mom, so I wanted to just coddle her and protect her from everything, from hurt with friendships and school and failure and sports and you name it. I wanted to have a very controlled, tight-knit environment to make it, to give her the best life possible, which really I think in turn was detrimental to her because she hasn't learned to set boundaries until she was 13. And so to answer your question with friends, it's setting boundaries of what she believes, what's right, what's wrong. And again, rather than me telling her in my little controlled environment and being a helicopter mom, it's empowering her to make those decisions. And now as she's older, I'm even in a relationship with a boy. So it's been an interesting process.
Yeah,
and we'll get to that one. I want to ask Zach about boys and his teenage daughter. But before we get to that, one of the things you mentioned, Heather, was just about the way we call it is transferring ownership. If you watch this topic later on, couples, we encourage you to do that. We define parenting as a transfer of ownership over the course of their lives. Well, at least over the course of their childhood, that eventually you're going to transfer ownership completely to them. So you're helping them set boundaries along the way, but at some point they're going to be out and off to college or off into their careers, and then you really can't set boundaries for them anymore.
Right.
And so, Tracy, maybe you can speak to that, because this is an example with friends. When our kids especially were little, I think you were a lot better about being thoughtful about the friends that they had. And I just was pretty oblivious to it. So there are probably some parents out there, maybe with younger kids at home, grade school kids or even junior high kids, who are saying, wait, we should be setting boundaries for our kids and their friend groups. What would you say to that?
Well, yeah, and even like in the age of social media, that's been another area where we have to teach our kids like to think about, it's not just posting a picture or putting some comment out there because in that moment that's what you felt like saying or doing. It's like that's out there, and that's a picture of who you are, that future people, future employers, colleges, people can see that and then draw conclusions about you. But even for my daughter who's in college, so we've kind of experienced a semi-launch of one child where...
But she's back.
But during the quarantine, she's back. We couldn't shake her.
We couldn't shake her.
But, we've had to watch her grow and have friendships and be experiencing a more independent life, and she's not coming to us anymore asking our opinion, or I can't say you can't do that or no. I have to trust that the boundaries and the ownership that we involved her in over time as she was in our home to say, okay, well, think about this. What are the possible dangers of doing that? And kind of empowering her to realize these are decisions that you're going to have to make on your own when mom and dad aren't around anymore.
Yeah, but to that point, even along the way, we've had to help her take ownership and discover some of these values for herself, rather than just as a 19-year-old or even as a 17-year-old a couple of years ago, just make the decision for her and say, nope, you can't do that, and I've made the decision. You kind of have to, I think, right? You have to, in parenting, I think it's a little bit more of an art.
Yeah. I
mean, along the way, certainly. I mean, there are times where I think you need to lay down the law, but there are other times where you need to say, well, what do you think? And what would you tell your kids when you're the parent? And somehow try to get them to take ownership for the choices that they're making, because obviously parents, probably, we're going to be making conservative, recommendations and choices for our kids, and the kids might make less than conservative decisions when it comes to them, which, Zach, leads us to the question of boys. So now, how do you, as a dad, even though you've only been her father for a few years here, but you're still a protective dad, do you help her set boundaries when it comes to boys?
I think first it's communicating, it's talking, it's asking a lot of questions about what they're doing, about how they're spending their time together, about who they're with, and then trying to provide some perspective, because Heather and I have both been 16 before, and we have been in her shoes. Obviously, not in the social media world, but we were still 16, 17-year-old kids or teenagers, and so we know what's going through their head, and we know what what they're feeling. So it's really just trying to get her to open up a little bit and communicate to us about what she's feeling, and after asking those questions, trying to encourage boundaries that are maybe sort of geared towards the way that she answers those questions or the way that she's thinking.
That's good.
And I would, I think if we've learned anything over the past 3 years, I think what we've learned is when we do set boundaries, typically the child is not in the middle of those boundaries. The child is right on the edge, if not over those boundaries.
For sure.
And so taking that into consideration when setting the boundaries is that they're probably gonna dip their toe or step over just to see what that's like. So
that's a good point. And I think
I love the way though that you guys talk about setting boundaries. I think Heather's perspective when she was younger and parenting as a single mom was setting a boundary was protecting, right? But I think that her perspective has changed as Madison has gotten older, but as we've grown together in our marriage, that setting a boundary is for to create her independence, and so that she starts making decisions, and so that she can be forward looking, and instead of just protecting her. So,
which I think is such a good point, and kind of goes to what you guys will be transitioning back to when you have your little baby, right? Because those early years, it's all about, we're doing everything for them. When they're infants and toddlers, they can't do anything. We have to teach them the world and danger and all those things. So you'll be at one end of the spectrum with your little guy, but then with Madison, you guys are nearing the end of that journey where, like you said, it's really more about pushing her towards independence and not just laying down the law, but teaching her the principle and hoping she'll apply it once she's out of your house.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit before we talk about little ones a little bit, because I think you've got some good insights for us. Let's talk a little bit about discipline, because discipline there's probably a good metaphor here, but I didn't think this through early enough. But discipline is really the tool that we use as parents to set boundaries, right? When our kids were little, we would discipline them. I would go ahead and say that we spanked our kids in love. Can I say that? Yeah. I don't know if you can do that anymore,
Well,
but
you said it, so
I said it. Deal with it, everybody. Okay, put your hate in the comments if you don't like that. But my parents spanked me. Tracy's parents spanked her.
A lot.
We're very, very grateful for loving discipline, because
done the right way. Yes.
Yeah, done the right way. Obviously not abusive, but loving discipline, because what discipline does is it reinforces that they just crossed over a boundary. Now, obviously, when they get into their teenage years, you still have to exercise discipline to reinforce the boundary. But the goal is, this is how I view it, it's a transfer of ownership, is they're learning self-discipline, so that you're going from the place, and our youngest now is 17, AJ, and he has learned how to discipline himself, right? He knows how to discipline himself because we have helped him understand and sort of take ownership and buy into boundaries in his own life.
But we're teaching him plenty about boundaries of speaking with respect, not being argumentative. So he may have those boundaries in place in some things, like with friends or with girls, things that he won't cross. But we're still working on some of those boundaries of what's an okay way to speak to your mom and what's a not okay.
Yeah.
Which is part of me communicating my boundaries to AJ of what I allow, but then it's also teaching him that you don't speak to people that way, no matter your level of comfort or whatever your mood. Like those are all things we still have to teach and discipline then to reinforce that boundary.
Yeah, couples, as you're watching this, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube live, why don't you use the comment section to let us know what areas that you're having to teach your kids boundaries right now. Maybe it's, how to, go to the bathroom if you've got little ones. Maybe there are boundaries for that, especially if you're a boy. Hit the Cheerio. Maybe you're trying to teach them boundaries with friendships or boundaries with girls or boys or with their language, or what are some other examples?
Well, like we talked about social media.
Yeah.
How you manage your time, especially in this COVID-19 thing. Like these kids have a lot of time on their hands.
Dads, one of the things with my son is we're talking about boundaries with purity. When it comes to purity, we're actually starting to read a book together, AJ and I are, because I want him to own that boundary for himself, and I want him to buy into it for himself. He's a teenage boy with hormones that are raging. Like I want to step into that conversation with him and say, look, I have to pursue purity too, just like you have to. And let's talk about, bouncing your eyes, and let's talk about some boundaries. One of the boundaries AJ sets on himself is he doesn't bring his phone downstairs. I appreciate that he owns his boundary. He's taking ownership of his boundary. So use the comment section to talk about the boundaries that you're trying to set with your kids right now. But back to Heather and Zach, what discipline measures have you found to be helpful, and which ones backfired on you? You have any insights for us on that?
I would say go ahead.
No.
The biggest discipline is Madison's phone. That's where it hits home, right? Because that's her means of communication, her means of entertainment, her means of everything. I mean, kids live through it right now, and so we've set really clear expectations or clear boundaries that we have for her to operate inside of that. And if she deviates, we're still pretty dang controlling with it. She loses her phone.
Yeah.
And that hits hard. I don't know what's backfired on us.
I think, we've tried a few times the go be in your room, but she would kind of prefer that a lot being a teenager. I think for us, one of the most important things that's been effective is that she knows that there are no boundaries relative to the phone because it's our phone, and that whatever goes on the phone, we look at on a nightly basis or every other night, and she doesn't have the ability to delete things. And if she does, she's in trouble. And so she knows whatever's going on social media or whatever's going on via text message is something that we're going to read. And that's been very helpful. And I think it's a
pretty controlling boundary though, right? I mean, we're not empowering her to make her own decision, but we're somewhat keeping tabs on what's going on.
But listen, I think that you, as parents, like we do our best, and you guys maybe in another 6 months, as you see Madison respond to different things, maybe that boundary will change a little bit, but it's still teaching her something. It's still, I mean, I don't want parents to be afraid. I kind of like what you said. Like, I don't think parents should be afraid to say, like, we bought the phone. So if we say you need to give us the phone, like most of our teenagers would be like, how dare you? You can't take my property from me. In fact, I think AJ has said that to me, to which I said, it's not your property, buddy. So, but again, I think that's all part of, as parents for our own kids, each situation's unique. You have to spend the time to set those boundaries to teach, but then over time to be able to say, Madison, in another 2 years, we're not going to be there to monitor that. So
for sure.
Learn these principles now so you're smart with your phone when we're not managing it.
Yeah, and we talk like that now with AJ. We're like, look, you're in another year and a half, you're going to be out, you're going to be off at college. Like, so he knows that he's on the clock. He knows that we're here to help him right now. And hopefully he'll have some good friends that help him set good boundaries. I mean, we hope he has that. But right now, like, we're the ones in his life every day, and And so we're reminding him, hey, someday soon you're going to be out there on your own. So again, learn to set boundaries for you. We'll help you right now, but really learn to set boundaries for yourself. So I've got one more question, because I'm sure parents out there are just dying to turn the screens off and have their own conversation. But we've got to just address one last question that I think I would imagine some parents are asking right now, is this seems really mean. That Zach guy seems really mean. You know, Brian's great, but that Zach guy seems really mean. What do you say to that, that objection that boundaries, discipline, boundaries seems mean? I want to be friends with my kids. I want them to love me, and I want everything to just be good, and I don't want it to set boundaries. What would you say to that?
Do you want me to answer that first?
Well, yeah, you answer it first, and then I should let Zach probably defend himself here.
Yeah, so. Zach will be more than ready to defend himself. Yeah, I just think as parents, our job is to train our kids and to get them ready for independence and to take ownership of their lives. And kids, actually, we crave boundaries and we crave rules. So it's actually less loving to just be your kid's friend and let them go willy-nilly and just let them reap consequences of things that they're just too immature to even understand some of that. So fight the urge to think, I just want to be their friend, and being their friend means I'm permissive and let them do whatever they want. No, you can be their friend by investing in what you want their future to be. And I trust me, they'll see that in the end. They may not love every boundary as it's happening, but in the future, as they get older, they'll look back and say, thank you for giving me that.
Zach, do you want to add to that? Go ahead, defend yourself now, mean dad.
Defend yourself, buddy.
Heather, you were called mean at times in your motherhood as well, right?
Oh, I'm still called mean. And my response is, I'm your mother, I'm not your friend. So
yeah.
I love you, and loving you can sometimes be really hard.
Yeah.
So but I probably have to defend myself more than he does.
Yeah.
But it's also our job, right? It's our job as parents, and we go back and forth a lot as we're laying in bed about, should we have done that, or should we have said this, or should we have set this boundary? And ultimately, as we talked about, we want to make decisions and set boundaries and have discussions that are 5 years out, are 2 years out, or 3 years out, not immediate discussions or decisions that are just happy in the moment, And if she comes back and says, well, you guys don't just want to have fun, you just won't let me do whatever you want, the response that I have is, Madison, that's not reality. That's not what life is. And when you do leave this house and you go become a student in college, your professor isn't going to let you take the test however many times you want. Your professor is going to set boundaries. And when you become an employee, you can't do whatever you want and spend all the time you want on your phone, because you're going to get fired. So we want to set you up for success long-term when you leave the house. Do we want to have fun here? Absolutely. But it's not just the chains are off and do whatever you want. That's typically my response. It doesn't always go over well, but that's how we feel.
But after the fact, we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, and the response after 2 weeks has been really positive. And Madison even recognizes and sees that. So Tracy, to your point, that kids thrive with structure, kids thrive with boundaries. And I think at the end of the day, they'll appreciate us for it.
That's good.
Yeah, that's so good. Man, I was so right, though. Everybody should rewind what Zach just said. He is mean. And I think it's good for people to realize that.
Zach, don't put up with that.
Hey, Zach and Heather, this has been awesome. It's been so good having you on this little double date night. In fact, I want to encourage you couples out there, do this with a friend. Say, hey, let's get on a Google Hangout together. You have dinner over there, we'll have dinner over here, and do some connecting like this, because this was a lot of fun. So Zach and Heather, thank you. And for all you couples out there watching, use those discussion questions down below. Have your own great conversation about setting boundaries in marriage. Don't forget, find many, many more topics just like this on our website. And we'll see you next week. Maybe we should do another double date. This was great.
We'll see if you behave.
Maybe. See you next week.